Okay. Francisco just gave me the thumbs up. All right, let's get started. My name is Elena Kondo, and I'm very, very excited and grateful. We're moving from women in mathematics to women in macro, and math is the link, I guess. And I'm very excited to introduce Alessandra Fogli. She's a monetary advisor and an associate director at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Alessandra is a macroeconomist who works a lot on questions related to the way I think about it is as deep institutional cultural fissures that shape not only individual economic outcomes, but macroeconomic outcomes. And she studies the feedback between the two. And today she's going to tell us her beliefs, social context, and macro outcomes. She's as I mentioned, she started Women in Macro. She's done a lot of work just in terms of understanding and reshaping how the field of macroeconomics, which within economics is a very gendered field. But she's just a top scholar. She's published very well and widely, and we're very grateful that she came all the way. So Alessandra, please take it away.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. I'm super excited to be here in this wonderful place. I'm from the south of Italy. I now live in the States, and I work at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, where it's very cold. So it's been really nice to be here back in the summer in a beautiful place. So my background is one in which I've been thinking about big macroeconomic outcomes, especially when it comes to gender and race. But also I've been sort of like not so satisfied by the standard approach in economics. So during my whole career, I've been trying to stay within, the main framework of economics, but at the same time, changing the things that I thought were, more the assumptions in the main framework that I thought needed to be reassessed. So in particular, when I think about women labor force participation, there is a large variation in outcomes, across countries in the world, but also within countries, across time, and within groups. And so the standard economic models that think about these differences have usually used the differences in technology or institutions or prices to sort of justify the observed large differences in outcomes. And in general, they take as given agents' beliefs and the preferences over these outcomes. So they take as given the social norms and the cultural environment where these people and these agents are taking their decisions. So basically, that's where my work comes to play. What I've been doing, during my whole career has been thinking about the link between social context and economic outcomes. So the idea is that agents do not live in a vacuum. They are not atomistic individuals that have all the same preferences and informed with the same notions, but actually they live in a context, in a social context, and this can be their country, it can be their family, it can be their neighborhoods, and this micro-interaction matters for the kind of information and the kind of beliefs that they have, and this matters for economic outcomes. And in turn, so the economic outcomes feed back into the social context of people, and so there is a feedback between social context and belief and economic outcomes. So this is a little challenging because you have to look at this and at the same time click over there. So the first facts that I want to show you is the incredible variation across different countries in labor force participation of women. So basically across the world, there are countries such as Yemen or Afghanistan where women labor force participation is below 10%, and other countries such as Iceland where it's over 80%. So how can we explain these, just thinking about differences in technology, right? I mean, you will think that some technology are really common across all these different countries. But not only that, it's not only that there is a large variation across countries, but even within a country. If we go back in time and we look at countries that now have really large labor force participation of women, such as Canada, UK, United States, Germany, they really did not look like that at the beginning of time. So there has been a larger change over time within countries. So in the standard framework, the explanation have been offered, the one that I studied when I was a PhD student, were about technological differences across countries and across space. So the introduction of the dishwasher was supposed to be like an important advancement that allowed women to work in the workplace. But I've always been a little bit puzzled why only women could really turn a dishwasher on. And that kind of explanation did not really ring right to me, but it actually had a lot of consequential work, in economics. Also, people have been pointing out the shift towards service sector, like the service sector seemed like a more amenable for women to work in. And again, it was not clear why. It was especially married women with children and not all women that seemed to be driving the large increase. So other people talk about how the wages have changed for women. So basically the idea was, well, now women make more, of course they work more, or there is a return in the return to experience for women, so they stick with the job to enjoy this increase in the return to experience. However, again, the wage gap, it's an equilibrium outcome. It's going to be observed as the outcome of equilibrium demand and supply conditions. So it's not that wages change by themselves for women. It's that, women over time undertook different kind of careers and entered different kind of fields and eventually experienced, and gained wages that were higher also because they were able to, to break some of the barriers that they were facing. So basically, I was pushing, back this idea that only women could activate a dishwasher and a vacuum cleaner, and that they were, sort of like just enjoying the benefits of increasing wages. But actually, I was thinking that women were at the same time, creating information and being role models for other women. And social norms were changing at the same time as the, as the society and economics was changing around them. So, moving forward, I think there is a lag. Okay, so as I say, technological explanation cannot reconcile within counter and across group large variation. These technological, advances became available to all women, single and married, with and without children. However, the change in female labor force participation was concentrated across women with children. Also, these jobs in the service sector and these electrical appliances and new medical advances in the health field require an adoption decisions. So, probably it was not the case that if you bring the dishwasher or, the pill in a Muslim country, the next day you can replicate the kind of labor force participation experienced by Iceland or United States. So, this is a bit annoying. Moreover, the difference was even within the same country. So basically, if you think, it's about technological advances or differences in health advances, it's hard to explain the large differences across countries in US. So within the same country, US, in 1980, labor force participation varied between 18 and 80%. across counties in US. So basically, in the same year, across counties in US, you experience the same variation in labor force participation that you experience across an entire century over time. So basically, it's hard to justify these differences just thinking that, these technological advances were really, the important mechanism. Moreover, the change over time really came across because married women with children start working. So this is like the increase from 1940 to today went from like less than 10% to about 60% today. So single women have always worked. Actually, instead, married women with children are the ones that did not work. So basically, this differential thought to me that there were some other forces behind this big change, and in particular, the idea was social norms, play an important role. Gender roles play an important role, and in particular, what people believe is right or wrong in terms of women taking care of the family and working in the market. So these differences in social norms, can explain these differences across groups, across time and space. So beliefs about women working, fertility, saving behavior, trust in others change over time and are very different across different countries. So here, for example, is the percentage of the US public that approves of working wives. And you can see that in 1940, now we think it's almost normal that women work on the market, but actually only 20% of the public in US in 1940 believed that it was approvable, that they approved that the women with children would work in the market. And this, has changed over time to about 80%. So there has been a large change, in social norms across, over time. But these differences also are pervasive across countries. So if we look at the statement where jobs are scarce, men should have a more right to a job than women, we see that there is a large difference between Tunisia and United Kingdom. In Tunisia, you find that about 80–90% of people think men should have priority, and while in United States, Spain, and United Kingdom, this is not the case. So large differences across countries and across space and over time. So basically, in the standard economic models, do not think about these differences, and they only model, the role of prices and technology and constraints in order to explain, the large outcomes. So what we did in a paper with my co-author Raquel Fernandez was to try to identify exactly, how much these social norms may affect the labor force participation of women. And to do that empirically is not obvious because there is a clear correlation between beliefs and outcomes. So countries where there are, where people disapprove of women working, there are going to be fewer women working and vice versa. However, we explored in this paper what is called the portability of social norms of culture. Basically, we look at second-generation immigrants in a new country and think about, for example, my kids, my daughter in US, she is an American, and she grew up with the same institutions and wages of all the other classmates of hers, but there is something different about her, and it's her family context, and it's the fact that her family, probably transmitted to her some values and some social norms that are, particular to Italy. So basically, we used second-generation women from the census data in 1970 and look at the labor force participation decision of these women, controlling for, their husband's education and income, their own education, the place where they were raised, the income of the, of their parental income, and all the possible observables, even their religion, and then we find that really, there was a large effect of the country of origin of labor force participation in the country of origin of their parents to explain 2000, the year 2000 labor force participation of these young women. So basically, we found that the labor force participation in the country of origin of the parents in 1950 could explain in about 1/3 of the variation in labor force participation of their, daughters that were raised in US, born and raised in US, facing the same wages and the same technology, but having different parents, born in different countries, and so transmitting them different kind of values and social norms about gender roles. And this was, a first empirical finding that was pretty robust because it was identifying, this fact, not just by simple correlation, but controlling for everything else in the place where these women were making their decisions. We also checked that these different countries of origin did not have any effect on the wages these women were perceiving. So there was no other mechanism through an observed human capital that could explain these differences. And we thought this was, a pretty good first finding to certify, the important role of family and the social norms in explaining these outcomes. Then we start asking how these, social norms really matter and how they imply and how they change over time, basically. Because what we did in the cross-country regression was to just check whether some, late variable in 1915 in Italy was still important for today's decisions. However, we know these decisions have changed, and women have changed over time, in their labor force participation decision. So what we did in the next paper was to think about how this family transmission may have changed the incentives of women to work over time. And this time we looked at men. And we look at the marriage return from the marriage market from women. Clearly, there was a child penalty when women were getting a lot of education. They were marrying less in the past, and women and men were marrying more. So there was clearly an education penalty for women to get too much education. But this has changed over time, and basically now women that have an education have about the same chance of getting married than women that don't have an education. So something was going on in the marriage market that changed in terms of the returns from working and getting an education. So what we did was looking at how attitudes of men towards a working wife depend on their family of origin. So we find out that using the PSID, that if you look at men that are, all the same by education, income, the place where they grow up, and all the observables you can control for, there is a very large effect coming from whether their moms worked when they grew up. So basically, there is clearly the same sort of gender roles story that is true for, my daughter that is now, deciding to work, to my son as well. So the fact that a man grew up in a family where the moms was working while he was growing up implies that he becomes a better match, either because he's going to help more or he's going to be more open to his wife working. And we found that after controlling for all sorts of possible observable for men, there is a very large effect of whether his own mother worked on the probability that his wife worked. About a 30% higher probability for a man that is all the same, but his mother is working instead of not. So this paper was published in the QJE, and we used this finding to inform a model where every time women were working, they were not just increasing the pool of women working, but were also creating a neural model for the men that one day was going to get married and making decisions, doing joint decisions about household and gender roles. So we exploited the World War II shock when women had to go to work because men were mobilized for World War II. So basically, after World War II, there was a scarcity of people working in factories because men had to go to war. And so we explored the differential in mobility rates across the different states to think about how, because men had to go to war, to the war, some women had to replace them. And so by having these women replacing them, there was a new, a larger fraction of men that learned the new gender roles, a new set of women, the next generation, that actually start working. And we find, a very large effect exactly in the states and in the regions where there was a higher mobilization rate of men. So in those states, men went to the war, women had to enter the labor force, and the next generation you observe, very higher participation rates for the new cohort of women that got married in those years. So that was like a second paper that we wrote, thinking about the dynamics of these, this micro. What are the macro outcomes of this micro implication? And then after that, we start thinking about how beliefs themselves, this was a transmission. Man grew up with a mother that was working, so he was a better partner for his wife that is more likely to work. But how exactly did that happen, So basically, there was a sort of a passive, reduced form approach in the model. We used the microestimates to inform, a dynamic model to come up with the aggregate implications, but we did not spell out the actual mechanism through which these beliefs were formed. We just used, the microestimate as a reduced form parameter in the large dynamic model. Then we start asking exactly what is the kind of micro interaction that changes your beliefs. And so we start thinking about the information mechanism. Basically, the people that you meet and at the neighbor level or at the regional level actually change the way you think about outcomes. In particular, it changes the probability distribution over outcomes. So we take the standard model this time. Before we took the standard model and just used these macro estimates in the parameter, now we take the standard model and we make some deeper changes in the assumptions of the standard model. In particular, we say people, individuals in the models are not perfectly informed all the time. They face uncertainty. In particular, if you think about adopting this technology and deciding to go to work and leave your kid with somebody else, or adopting, the new technology that comes around, the child care, outsourcing the child care, these are all decisions that you're uncertain about. You're not sure how they're going to impact your kid. And some people have very different ideas about how this is going to affect children. And even today, people do not agree about whether, women that work have the same kind of relationship with their kid and in terms of, their future outcomes. So basically, we think about how these individuals in the model don't have common knowledge, they face uncertainty, and they've had to acquire information from the social context. So if the social context changes, the information you observe is going to change, and that is going to be reflected in your beliefs and then in your choices. So we're going to use learning models and network theory to provide the micro foundation of this, augmented model. And then we can use spatial implications. Basically, we can see how your, people around you, how much they are working, what kind of information they have, to check and validate the models with information acquisition. So today we're going to look at two applications. One is going to be exactly on women labor force participation, and the other one is going to be about race. So as I was mentioning, we start thinking about how this women labor force participation decision may depend on the people around you, on the local interaction. So the idea is that the women participation, when women work, they generate information for women close to them. And this information, in turn, affects their future participation in the labor market. And this kind of implication can be tested using labor force participation data across time and across space. Not only that, but some kind of model like this, where what is important is the kind of experience, the experience you have around you, can actually be used also to think about the important effect of racial segregation on wage gap, and how over time the fact that there was the long shadow of racial segregation in US and the effect of neighborhoods on children outcomes. So in another application, we are thinking about how people form beliefs about another group as they experience, different neighborhoods around them, and they have different experience about their wage gap. So in the first paper, the one on women labor force participation, Econometric 2011, there is this fundamental uncertainty on how outsourcing child care affects children outcomes. And this is, as I was showing you before, from the picture about the social norms, is still, a really contentious matter. Not everybody agrees on whether women should, work in the labor market. Maybe they should work, but a little less than men. Maybe they should work part-time. Maybe they should not work at all. I mean, it's still not clear that we all agree about, what is the right role of women. So the way we model that is about uncertainty on the outcomes of children. So children outcomes depend on children ability, but also depends on the choice of their mother to work or not. And how much of that matters is parameterized by this parameter theta. And the idea is that women just don't know how much theta is, okay? So there is uncertainty about that parameter. And the ability is also unobservable. And there's two things, their nurture, which is the mother, working or not working, and nature, the ability of the kid, combine to generate the future outcomes of the children. So how do women learn about this parameter? The idea is that this parameter, is normally distributed, and at the beginning of time, women have a very diffuse priors about this data. Basically, it's not clear, what data is, and what they do is observing women around them. And basically, what they're gonna do is to receive signals from the labor force participation around them and see how the kids of the women working are doing, and basically regress, I'm doing a Bayesian updating, so running a regression in their mind of the children outcomes on the past labor force participation of their mother. And because women are risk averse, when this process of updating of beliefs takes place, there is a less uncertainty over time. So basically, in our model, women are all on average right. So they take on their distribution of beliefs have a mean that is equal to the real theta in the economy, that, by the way, has been estimated as just a very small cost. But over time, what really matters is that at the beginning, they have a very large variance across these, around this median. But then over time, because more women are working and more information is generated, these beliefs tend to converge to the real theta. And because there is less uncertainty and women are risk averse, there is going to be a higher participation exactly in those regions where women start working. So going back to, for example, World War II or the, some initial shock to labor force participation, when some women start working, they generate information for other women. The other women update their belief and have less uncertainty about outcomes, and the reduction in this risk associated with working makes more women decide to jump in the labor force. So basically, we use, this general equilibrium model where women are updating their beliefs and look at what happens over time to labor force participation. So in the data are the green line. This is US. Remember, for married women with children, there was a very low labor force participation rate. And then in 2000, it sort of plateaued to about 60%. A model, the blue line, that only has, this updating using belief, generating more information and less uncertainty over the outcomes, can explain up to 1/3 of the change over time. So we're not saying this is going to be the whole story, but we're saying that a mechanism that is just taking, this Bayesian updating and basically using it in a standard model where women are, starting with some uncertainty and then learning over time, generates on aggregate 1/3 of the increase that we observe in the data. Not only that, but also it generates the right spatial correlation. So basically, it really shows that there is large differences across regions, just like in the data, because in some regions women were more working at the beginning and some did not. And also there is an increasing in correlation between labor force participation across space. So the spatial correlation goes up, which is another implication of a learning model, because women that are going to work more, are more likely to work, are those that live in the region where the other women start working. And this generates, more spatial correlation in the data. And so the dispersion is going, it's actually the same that we observe in the data. So sorry, skip one. So a model like this, where we microfound, the belief, where they come from, how they change, how eventually, the fact that more women are working, change beliefs, make more women working, and so there is a continuous dynamic relationship between outcomes and beliefs, can actually be used also to think about race. So this is another very important field, topic that I've been working on more recently. But some of the content that I've been using, in past research applies to my more recent research. So basically what I observed and what is well known is that in US there are large differences in outcomes across different races. So basically between black and white there are large gaps that are still there, in education outcomes, in unemployment rates. The unemployment rate is twice for black people, is about twice the one for white. And this is really a very strong finding, even after controlling for education and all the possible observables. You still find, these large differences across groups that cannot be explained by observables. Large differences in their earnings, of course, large difference in the home ownership rate, and huge differences across in wealth. So in recent research, I've been working on thinking about segregation by neighborhoods and how neighborhoods matter for the economic success of children. And what happened and I thought that this kind of environment economic model can be used also to think about what past racial segregation may have, how the long history of racial segregation in US may still affect outcomes of children today. In a standard model of economics, again, these differences are sort of like assumed away. How are they assumed away? Well, we know that for gender roles, the standard explanation is that dishwashers were not invented yet. And now that we have dishwasher, women can work. For race, we simply have a dummy variable that says, well, if you belong to another race, you're gonna, observe some differences in outcomes. So just like the gender wage gap, wage rates gap are robust when controlling for observable. So even after controlling for all education and many other background variables, you still find large differences both by gender and by race. So what the standard model had done was to think about race as a residuals. So basically there is a large literature out there that is estimating this wage equation. So reduced form models, incorporating the race as a dummy variable. So basically, if you're in one race or you're in another race, you're gonna receive a different wage from the labor market. Otherwise, the race is captured as differences in preferences associated to specific phenotype. So some people have a different risk aversion, discount factors, or preferences for leisure. So this kind of theories, one that is just a residual, the black box, and one that is moving just by a little bit the black box and saying, well, it's not really a black box, it's not that people are different, it's that they're different because they're different in risk aversion, discount factor, or preference for leisure, is not satisfactory. So it's not easy to model race in economic model because what is exactly, the color of your skin, and why not the color of your hair? But that's what we try to do in this new paper that is not published yet, but is my more recent work with Veronica Guerrieri and Marta Prato. So the idea is that, again, this fact that the beliefs are informed by your past experience and that they evolve because of the context where you live is again useful to think about these differences in outcomes. So the idea is that the fact that you observe differences across groups, so you observe wage gaps, may eventually make you think there are gaps in the ability of different groups, and this can confirm the initial beliefs. So there could be a feedback between beliefs and outcomes, even when it comes to racial gaps. If there are big racial gaps, then people without information may end up thinking there are differences in the actual way in which people perform and in their productivity. So this is a picture of how many people in society think that discrimination is a barrier to blacks getting ahead. So basically, you can see that there has been a change from 60 to 50% in the people that think that the blacks are mostly responsible for their own condition. So the idea is that how many people out there think that blacks are, face a barrier, and how many think that really it's their own fault. And this idea is coming from the fact that people think about opportunities that are given to them as the opportunities that are given to everybody. And they don't think there are differences in the opportunities other people face, and simply they have not experienced them. And that's why they, abstract from them. So there has been changes, but not as fast and as much as you would, hope for. And in our model, we model this fact, these differences in beliefs, by thinking about a stylized model of racial segregation. So basically, in the model, we assume that the ability for these two types, black and white, is exactly the same. However, they start with very different, wages distribution. So in particular, white distribution of wages is shifted on the right compared to black. And the idea is that these differences, the initial differences, are the outcomes of racial segregation over time. So in this model, parents choose the education of their children, and they choose the neighborhood where to raise their child. And the children's wage in a neighborhood depends on his parents' wage, on his own ability, on the education that is given, but also on the neighborhood where it's raised. So there has been a really large literature, recent literature, by Chetty, Hendren, and co-authors showing that there is a large effect on the neighborhoods on the children outcomes. So children that have the same ability, the same family resources, can do much better in life if they're raised in a neighborhood that has a high externality, meaning that the composition of the neighborhood is one in which there are high ability peers and rich parents. Those neighborhoods have less crime, better public schools, better experiences of learning models, and so on. And so basically they are a better place for children to really enjoy better outcomes in the future. So this is spillover, so how much the neighbor matters depends on the expected future wage of the children themselves. So basically it's a fixed point in our language where parents take as given how these externalities, this distribution of abilities and income expected in the neighborhood, and they make decisions that are consistent in equilibrium with those expectations. So in this model, parents maximize their consumption and they care about their children's outcomes. And when they decide where to live, they take into consideration that a better neighborhood is more expensive, but also is better for their kids. So what happens is that in equilibrium, this is the equilibrium solution, where on the y-axis you have the parent's wage, and on the x-axis you have the ability of the kid. So basically what happens is that if you have a kid that is very, very smart, even if your wage is not very high, you want to go and live in the high spillover and more expensive neighborhood, because basically that is going to be good for your child. But otherwise, if you're poor, or if your child is not as smart, you end up living in a neighborhood where most people are poor and most children are low ability. And so this is going to reinforce the fact that in the next period, the children will have fewer opportunities. So basically, this is a model where rich parents can afford, better neighborhoods. The better neighborhoods are going to make their kids even more able to take advantage of these opportunities, and so generates more segregation and more inequality over time. So how does, belief come into play? So now let's suppose there is a little bit of uncertainty again, not about children, not about how women labor force participation affects children outcomes, but how neighborhoods affect the children outcomes. So we're going to apply a similar reasoning we did before. Remember, the wage of the children depend on the ability of the child and the labor force participation of decision of the mother. And she was uncertain about the role of nurture in her own decision in these children's outcomes. Now the wage of the child depends on the neighborhood where he's raised and his ability, and the uncertainty is about how much the neighborhood matters in this equation. And I think, this is a pretty plausible assumption that we don't really know how much a neighbor matters in the future outcomes of children. So basically, we start with some initial condition where Black are more segregated. And this is a very plausible assumption. So what happens is that because Black are segregated, they have low spillover, they have a lower future wage of the children. But the income, but the problem is that white don't know the actual effect of neighborhoods and racial segregation on wages, and so basically white attribute the income gap they observe to differential ability instead of differential neighborhood composition. So if there is uncertainty between how much is the neighborhood and how much is ability, and one group has been, segregated for a long time, and they've been, growing up in, in lower opportunity neighborhoods, they're going to experience lower wages. And by observing these differential wages, white, that have no perfect information, assume that this is that the spillover that they are, that the black people are exposed to is the same of their own. So basically, they think that the average spillover in one neighborhood and in the other is the same. So by doing this, they actually sort of, there is this racial bias that that forms. And in a model without and with discrimination, there is a very different neighbor composition by race. So if we introduce this assumption in a model where parents are deciding where to raise their children, they're gonna have a sort of a racial bias against the black people, because they think when black people come, they come with lower ability, and so they reduce my spillover in my neighborhood. So a model without discrimination already has, a small share of black people in the rich neighborhood, just because of the initial conditions that are different between the two groups. Black people are more poor, they cannot afford, the rich neighborhoods, and this is one channel. But there is another channel that is not only black people are poor and they cannot afford the nice neighborhoods, and this will go eventually away as black people become rich. But there is another mechanism that is through discrimination, through the endogenous bias. It's not just that black people are poor, but it's that white people are discriminating, and they're associating this lower this wage gap to lower ability, and so they assume in their optimization problem a lower spillover when black people come in, and basically there is even fewer black people that really live around them. If there are fewer black people living around them, there is going to be even less information and less opportunity to learn about the true ability distribution that is exactly identical in the model. So basically, this is a model where initial differences can create, segregation and can create wage gaps, but also they give rise to racial discrimination, which, makes the segregation even worse and keeps these differences over time in the outcomes. So basically, this is how the wage gap, the observed outcome, the wage differences between black and white, evolves over time in a model with and without discrimination. So basically, if we start with the sum wage gap that is due to the long shadow of the racial segregation at the beginning of time, then when we let the model run, initially the wage gap will close because the ability distribution underlying is the same. So eventually the high ability, black kids will do better and will start catching up, and the wage gap will eventually be reduced. However, there is a second mechanism that is through, the fact that black people are poor, that get stuck into this, poor neighborhood with the lower spillover, that makes the wage gap still, surviving, lower but persistent wage gap over time. If we build on top the discrimination and the endogenous racial bias, we have the blue line. So basically, the blue line is showing you that the wage gap would even, increase over time, and and there are big differences over time, but is due not only to the fact that there are initial differences in income, but also, the fact that there are going to be differences that are due to racial discrimination and eventually generate a more wage gap, which in turn generate more discrimination. And I'm almost done. Just to say that why do we care? Why do we care to put, these extra bells and whistles in an economic model and model uncertainty, and instead of just have perfect information and model how people interact with each other, how they learn, what they observe, how they update their beliefs. We do this because it matters, and it matters for policy implications. So, for example, if race is simply a residual, and there is no other thing to say that, well, there is one group that is making more and another group that is making less, and it's all economists can say, one group has a lower unemployment, the other group has higher unemployment, there is really no role for policy. Moreover, if race is just a difference in preferences, some people like to work more and some people like to work less, then also there is not for policy, because why we change, people preferences? There is no policy that wants to change people preferences. They're happy the way they are. Some women prefer to stay with their kids. Some women, want to work. Some people like to work more, and some people want to work less. But if instead, what race and racial bias and gender roles emerges the endogenous, outcome of beliefs that are due to the aggregate outcomes they experience, then there is a large role for policy. And in particular, for example, if we think about policies that target these gaps, that make, neighborhood being better for some kids, that invest in the public school, that invest in, for example, even reparation. We do a lot of policy experiments in the paper, where we show that policy in this context has a very large role and can improve at the same time not only equity, but also efficiency. Because now those people that are able, women and minorities, can participate in the labor market and generate larger future gains. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra, for a journey through time, space, gender, race, belief, social context. We have time for a few questions. We have about 10 minutes if you have your hands up. Take it early.
Thank you so much for such a comprehensive and thoughtful talk. And I really loved how you closed it with policy implications here. And I was curious about what the policy implications are for some of the work that you presented in the first half of your talk about gender. So is an example that because we see these kind of generational gaps, that investment in one generation has long propagating effects. If we just find a way to connect women in this generation with jobs, then we'll see those effects for their children. So we can kind of scale up the amount of money that we're investing in this. Or how would you extrapolate?
Yes, you got it exactly right. So we have not explored the policy implication of our model for gender, but there is a paper that can be written there where definitely there is an externality. So basically this information is an externality. As women work, they generate information. There is an information externalities for other women. And so basically in our model, we can also reconcile the fact that women are breaking the ceilings and are taking over time more, risky and well-paid jobs that require, more time and dedication. And by doing this, we can also generate, the increase in the shrinking in the wage gap. Basically, an implication of the model is that the wage gap will decrease. And it's not an external change, an exogenous change that is drivable for participation, but it's both ways. So policy can have a large effect, and in a way, we think that even affirmative action kind of policy in this model can have an effect. It's a temporary effect, but you see it's a persistent effect. So by changing this equilibrium once, you generate this new generation, and then eventually you end up in a different steady state. So there is a large, as I was mentioning, the fact that we took at heart, the modeling of this micro interaction and this information diffusion, how people form this belief over time, is because it's relevant for policy, and it's relevant for policy both when it comes to women working in the workplace and when it comes to neighborhood segregation. Thank you for the question.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you for a really wonderful talk. I also want to follow up a little bit on the policy implications here. So if I understand like sort of the last bullet on the slide, you're saying here that basically interventions that reduce racial gaps will have these compounding benefits basically, right, like over time. I'm curious if your model also kind of makes predictions about what kinds of interventions basically will be more or less effective.
Sure. So we have another paper actually that is thinking about neighbor intervention. As I was mentioning before, we have not completely explored the effects of information when it comes to gender roles, even if we have another paper about networks that is thinking about how you can diffuse information, how it is important to, for example, something that is also important when it comes to gender is that people don't learn from aggregates. Usually people learn from people similar to them. So social distance is important too. It's not just income difference, you know, and it's not just aggregates. Really people learn from other people that are similar, and they think that that outcome, you know, may eventually, you know, affect them. So one thing that we learn is that intervention should think about who is close, you know, like role models or people in the social context that is close by are those that are mostly, you know, able to change your, is where you get your information, is are more likely to change your beliefs. So this in the term, in the gender roles context. In the neighborhood context, we have explored several policies. And long story short, for example, we thought about moving to opportunities. And we used the model, the general equilibrium model, to think about how housing prices change and how these externalities change when you move people around. And when you move people around, unfortunately, I have to say, you know, not everything goes in the right direction, because if you start thinking about moving all the poor people in the rich neighborhood, guess what happens? I mean, like, you're just shifting, you know, the problem around, but you're not solving the problem. And this is pretty clear from the kind of results that we find. So in other terms, if you move poor people in the rich neighborhood, the rich neighborhood is going to become poor. The poor people, the rich people will leave the rich neighborhood, and you're just going to restore, you know, like the same equilibrium, just switching the labels. Then we tried another policy, which was just transfer income, just give poor people some income, tax the rich, give the money to the poor, and maybe that will fix the problem. It doesn't either. And you know why? Because now every poor wants to go where the transfer is given, that is in the poor neighborhood. So basically what happens is that you increase segregation. All the poor people from other neighborhoods just want to live where the transfers are given in the poor neighborhood, and so segregation increases in that context. So basically what we find is the last policy that we think works the best, and is actually to invest, not just give to the parents some money, then not always get transferred to the kids or to the schools, but sometimes it just get consumed because people are poor and they want to eat. But that means it doesn't have long-lasting, you know, effects, does not change the neighborhoods, it just make people eat a bit more in their neighborhood, but it's not an investment, it's a consumption. So what happens is instead what we're trying to do is something, and I come from Italy and I come from Europe, is to equalize the resources across the neighborhoods in terms of the spillover. So give more money to the infrastructure, to the schools, to reduce crime, to improve, you know, the long-term investments. If you do that, if you can use those resources to improve the spillover so that now the return from your investment is the same in A, in B, and C, then it's when the rich family say, well, wait a minute, that school is so good. The public school in C is so good. Why am I spending this much money in the private school in A if I can go to C and, save money and give my kids the best education? So investing in public schools, and in particular, we're using this paper by Barbara Biasi, because investing in schools sometimes has been very effective, sometimes it's not. So how you spend the money in the school also matters. Is actually the way that we find, welfare can be improved and segregation can be reduced. So at the same time, you have this switch where rich parents now want to live in the initially poor neighborhood because there are still good schools and good opportunities for the kids. And by going there, they make the neighborhood even better, bring in their resources, bring in their human capital and money. And so basically this way you can have convergence, reduce the segregation, and basically convergence across opportunities for all children. And this is also coming from my own experience. In Italy, we have a public school system that is financed at the federal level. And in US, this is not the case. Basically, neighbor-level resources are spent on local schools. And so reflect, the kind of poverty in the neighborhood.
Thanks for the great talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about model evaluation and like how you're matching your developed models to the data.
Sure. Oh, wow. Thank you for the question. So there are a couple of things that I had to sort of put under the rug because there was no time for all the details. But for example, here is the one that I like. According, for example, to technological explanation, the price of these fabulous advances, like vacuum cleaner and dishwasher, has been going down over time. And so basically these allowed women to enter the labor force. But this implies that in the cross-section, what these models generate is at the beginning of time, in 1940, 1950, the women that could, enter the labor force were the ones that could afford these super expensive new appliances. So they were the rich ones. That was not true. That was absolutely not true. The women that were working at the beginning were the women that were poor and that they had to work. And did not just, they were not just rich and could, liberate themselves. This paper was called Engines of Liberation, where the dishwasher was really, liberating women. But those women that were working at the beginning of time were women that actually were poor and they had to work and they had to leave, their kids home in spite of the risk and the gender the gender roles prevalent at that time. And so basically our explanation instead gets that. For example, so at the beginning of time, risk-averse women had to enter in the labor force, in the labor market, when the wage of their husbands could not allow them, enough consumption for themselves and for their children. So our implications of the model is that in the cross-section, you see that over time are going to be, richer and richer women that start working instead at the beginning of time where the poor ones that start working. And this is, for example, another implication of the model that is, consistent with the facts. And then, this idea that even, the arrival of child care opportunities and so on, these are, or service sector, these are always demand and supply effects. As more women enter the labor market, there is more demand for child care. As women enter the labor market, there is more demand for technological appliances. So let's say that these models of information and belief diffusion sort of can reconcile some of these other implications. For example, also the spatial correlation that we can generate, and it's not part of the technological explanation. Technological explanation is about the arrival of new technology, and they diffuse everywhere in the same way. Instead, our explanation is one about local interactions. So it's one in which you expect the larger gain, precisely in those regions where there was the initial, participation of women. And this is not true in those other explanations where, there is a shock, where this price of durables are going down over time everywhere the same. So these two, implications, for example, one has to do with geography of the change, and the other that has to do with the cross-sectional differences, is something that we can reconcile and that other theories do not take into account.
All right, we have time for one last question. I think Mercy will take it, and we'll have a break after that.
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I had a question about a paper you published in Econometrics on the effect of nurture and ability for women. Has there been any studies also looking at the effect of fathers working outside the home in various levels, so stay at home versus partial versus
Yes.
fully working, and how that balances with the mothers working as well, mainly consequential also for homes that may have two same-sex parents too. So.
Sure. Fantastic questions. I mean, now we're going to write another number of papers after this lecture to incorporate all the questions you're asking. So yes, but I have never written a paper yet. Men were already a little, you have to get along with men if you're in economics. So they were already not happy with the paper about how their mothers, are affecting their choices of wives. So I did not pursue, anymore that venue. But I also looked into the data and seen that actually the role of fathers is very important in raising their children. And I look at, for example, the consequences on divorce and, and other, the role of families in explaining also the race gap. So family structure is different across races. Many more single mothers, across in the Black community, actually does affect children. And this is, like the consequences of many, policies and that have been implemented, fewer men around, and more disruption experiences for Black families. So this is also like a very interesting area of research, trying to think more how much of that wage gap do we observe, across races, could be due also to differences in family structure and the role of fathers, which is very important in bringing up children, in the children's future outcomes.
Please join me in thanking Alessandra Fogli.
Thank you. Thank you so much.